So, a show of hands. How many times have you all genders been told by someone to smile, honey? Especially if it seemed to relate to how someone of your perceived gender ought to behave. How many times have you, of all genders, been told by someone that it's not okay to cry? Especially if it relates to how someone of your perceived gender ought to behave. The glibly noble pursuit of happiness baked into our nation's foundational documents, even as we made that pursuit an impossibility for the vast majority of those living in what would become the USA, those from whom the land was stolen, those captured and enslaved and deprived of even the most basic happiness found in the security of family, those too impoverished to pursue any happiness beyond a warm meal or a place to lay their head. The heartaches represented by these founding stories have been lost. They have been subsumed to that turn of phrase made saccharine through ignorance and a lack of compassion, such that we now seem steeped in a culture of sunshine and positivity. The pursuit of happiness is a noble goal. Smile, honey. Men don't cry. Forcing happiness in this way is, as one writer put it, the tyranny of positivity. In the story that I shared earlier about the creation of Inside Out, I talked about how the director of the film, Pete Docter, went to talk to a UC Berkeley professor of psychology, a man named Dr. Keltner. Keltner's work, as described by writer Susan Cain, whose book, Bittersweet, I am drawing on heavily for my sermon this morning with immense gratitude, is oriented around something that he calls the compassionate instinct. The idea that we humans are wired to respond to each other's troubles with care. Our nervous systems make little distinction between our pain and the pain of others. They react similarly to both. For Keltner, the compassionate instinct is a key feature of how humans have managed to survive and even thrive in our world throughout our evolutionary journey. Compassion literally means to suffer together. Keltner has mapped this compassionate instinct in our brains and in our bodies, and he has found that it lights up a variety of regions when activated. From the anterior cingulate region of your cortex to the more evolutionary ancient parts of our nervous system, and the mammalian region known as the periaqueductal gray, I had it, I practiced it, which causes mothers to nurture their young. And aside here, have you ever wondered why so many lullabies throughout the world are sung in minor keys with melancholic overtones? Rockabye babies who fall from their treetop cradles. We approach the most intimate, caring moments toward our vulnerable loved ones by forcefully activating our compassion. Back to the brain science. Compassion, when activated, shows up in an even older, deeper, and more fundamental part of the nervous system known as the vagus nerve, which connects the brainstem to the neck and the torso, and it is the largest and one of the most important bundles of nerves. The vagus nerve has many functions. It connects to digestion and to sex and to breathing, or as Cain puts it, the mechanics of being alive. But Keltner's research noted another of its purposes. When we witness suffering, our vagus nerve makes us care. I recently received a hug from a friend after a really hard couple of weeks. Even though I hadn't been feeling sorrow in that moment, the human touch told me that I wasn't alone, that my friend held compassion for me in her arms, and I was moved to tears by the touch that was actually kind of an activation of that vagus nerve. That's how powerful it is. it is surprisingly easy to activate. In some religious and cultural rituals, they depend on its regular activation. When you meet someone and you bow down, you are both activating your vagus nerve and demonstrating a unity. When the muezzin calls you to arrive at the mosque and lay down your prayer mat and you kneel in the company of others, strangers, friends, and engage in repeated stretching bows toward the ground, that activates the vagus nerve. It happens regularly through yoga, which many consider an individual activity, but done in space with others between their presence and the activation of that nerve, a sort of communal unity is experienced. Even the natural instinct to bow our heads when we experience beauty, a work of art, a piece of music, a stunning vista, that is an activation of that nerve. Other researchers have also found that this connection between sadness and unity exists. The work of some neuroscientists has shown that helping people in need stimulates the same brain region as winning a prize or eating a delicious meal. Those among us who have experienced depression may know this instinctively, but it's also backed up by science. The Tufts University psychology professor Nasir Gaimi notes that depression deepens natural empathy and produces someone for whom the inescapable web of interdependence is a personal reality, not a fanciful wish. That's a quotation. The inescapable web of interdependence is a personal reality, not a fanciful wish. I'm sorry. What did he say? The inescapable web of interdependence? Let's stop for a second and remind ourselves of the seventh principle of Unitarian Universalism, respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. Where Keltner's work takes us is far away from the patronizing "smile, honey," the limiting "real men don't cry," and the devotion to happiness at all costs ethos for which our nation is known. In his words, caring is right at the heart of human existence. Sadness is about caring, and the mother of sadness is compassion. This is why we share our joys and concerns in our worship each week. It's why the video meditation that I showed just after that likely activated all of those brain regions I just described, the combination of all those brain and body nerve activations that allows us to process people we've never met as if their pain is our own. I'm curious about what you're experiencing right now as you hear this. A little bit of duh, of course. Perhaps some so what? Maybe some aha, that makes sense, and then so what? What does an embrace of sadness and an attendant orientation toward compassion mean for us in our daily lives? What do we gain if we reclaim our tears with gratitude? My intent in bringing this to you today is to invite that question of how we might achieve greater unity as communities, large and small. Why do Euro-Americans seem so devoted to cultural rituals that only emphasize the positive, when cultures from around the world manage to celebrate the joy and the sorrow in life? The Mexican Day of the Dead, the Jewish Yom Kippur, Navajo weavers who intentionally place imperfections in their work, Japanese artists who embrace the aesthetic of wabi-sabi, which acknowledges that nothing lasts, that nothing is finished, that nothing is permanent. In Morocco, if you ask someone how they're doing, be prepared to sit down for a long cup of tea. More commonly in this nation, the expected response to "how are you" is "fine." The salvific hug from my friend that I referenced earlier is an anomaly. Because we sing happy birthday to ourselves and our country, we light off fireworks and we hold parades with brass bands and strewn candy. We neglect our ancestors and we celebrate birth, though we often refuse to make space for mourning lost life in the form of miscarriage. On the stolen land that became this nation, settlers found seemingly unlimited resources, and they were waiting to be exploited. They went out toward newer and newer frontiers that enabled a reinvention of self, rather than having to make peace with the sorrows they might have been running from. Ironically, many Euro-American colonists were fleeing persecution, but they managed to transform that experience not into a shared compassion toward those they encountered, but an in-group, us versus them, fear-based theology of predestination that forced people to behave as though they were perfect, because only in perfect behavior could their eventual salvation be observed. This history makes me cry. Even as we left behind predestination as a theological orientation, we transformed it into the myth of the self-made man, always man, whose outer success was evidence of their inner worth. Why else would those who lost everything in the boom-bust cycles of capitalism throughout American history be so predisposed to ending their lives? Because a newspaper headline in 1929 read, "Loser in street chooses suicide." We made no space for error, for redemption, for failure, for grace, for compassion, for sadness. After receiving their melancholy lullabies in their nurseries, our children throughout history have been trained through organizations that would turn into scouting to, as a 1908 pamphlet put it, look for the bright side of life. Cheerfully do tasks that come your way. What a disservice this does. Passing down the original sins of the nation onto the heads of our children. In spite of Phil Doctors, the director of Inside Out, his initial distaste for the idea of putting in sadness at the center of work of art, and with that, to provide people to connect with all ages with that character deeply, children's stories are frequently filled with sadness and loss. For years, there wasn't a single Disney movie that didn't begin with the tragic death of a parent. Was the aim to traumatize a young audience, or to set the stage for the transformation that is only possible when sorrow is alchemized into compassion, a need to develop a reliance on others, and ultimately an awareness of personal power and agency that you can only get if you temper that pursuit of happiness with an awareness that sorrow is on the other side. We must transform our national obsession with perfection and positivity into one that acknowledges that imperfection is not a failing, it is human, that sadness is a part of that. And we must train ourselves to see the humanity in others, even as they fail us. As you walk through the world, imagine the inner thoughts of those you encounter. What can they teach you about the nature of sadness? About the power of compassion, about what we all share, if we allow ourselves to embrace the tears and see them not as flaws, but as salty diamonds drawn down our faces, the glittering beauties of honest, authentic living. Those tears are the ultimate bonding agent. They are the source of any unity to be found in community. So may it be. Amen.